The first prayer I offered to the wrong God was a plea for mercy. My name is Father Matthias Caney, and for 37 years I served as keeper of the Shrine of Divine Suffering on the agri-world of Thessia Prime. I had tended the Emperor's altar through harvest festivals and famine years, through the celebrations of imperial victories and the mourning of necessary sacrifices. I believed with absolute certainty that the God Emperor of mankind watched over his faithful servants and rewarded their devotion with protection from the darkness that threatened to consume the galaxy. That faith died on the day the plague ships arrived. The first signs appeared in the outer settlements: reports of crops failing overnight, livestock collapsing in their fields, workers developing strange pustules that wept tears of blood. The planetary governor dismissed these incidents as isolated outbreaks of common agricultural diseases, nothing that couldn't be contained through proper quarantine procedures and the application of approved medical treatments. But I could see what the officials refused to acknowledge. This was no natural plague, no simple failure of crops or livestock. The pattern of infection followed lines that corresponded to ancient ley lines, places where the barrier between our world and the Imperium grew thin. The pustules that covered the afflicted formed symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to writhe and change when observed for too long. "Father Caney," called Sister Amelie as she approached the shrine's medical station, where I was tending to refugees from the affected areas. "We need more beds. The sick keep coming, and nothing we do seems to help them. The Emperor's mercy feels distant in this place." She was right, of course. Every prayer I offered seemed to dissipate into empty air. Every blessing I performed failed to ease the suffering of those who sought sanctuary at the shrine. The faithful who had once found comfort in ritual and scripture now looked at me with eyes that asked questions I couldn't answer. Where was the Emperor's protection? Why did the faithful suffer while the corrupt prospered? What sin had they committed to deserve such abandonment? I had no answers for them, because I was asking the same questions myself. 37 years of faithful service, 37 years of teaching others that the Emperor's love was infinite and his protection absolute. But watching children die in agony while their parents begged me to intercede with the divine, I began to wonder if everything I had believed was simply a comforting lie designed to make suffering bearable. The crisis deepened when the plague reached the shrine itself. Sister Amelie was among the first to succumb, developing the characteristic pustules along her arms and neck while maintaining her duties in the medical station. She died slowly, painfully, calling out the Emperor's name until her voice failed and her throat closed with infected tissue. "Why doesn't he answer?" she whispered with her last breath, her eyes fixed on the golden aquila that dominated the shrine's central altar. "We've served him faithfully. Why won't he save us?" I had no answer for her, just as I had no answer for the dozens of others who died in similar fashion over the following weeks. The shrine that had once been a place of healing and comfort became a charnel house where the faithful came to die in the shadow of symbols that seemed to mock their devotion. But it was during the death of young Timothy Chen, barely 16 years old and pure in his faith, that I first heard the voice that would damn my soul. As the boy convulsed in his final moments, as his parents wept and begged for divine intervention that never came, something spoke to me from the spaces between thoughts. "Your God does not hear you," the voice whispered with the sound of autumn leaves and distant thunder. "Your prayers fall upon deaf ears. Your faith serves only to make your suffering more exquisite. But there are others who listen, others who care about the pain of mortals." I should have recoiled from that voice, should have recognized it immediately as the whisper of damnation itself. Every lesson of my theological training should have screamed warnings about the corruption that was reaching for my soul. But in that moment, with Timothy's death rattle echoing through the shrine while his parents collapsed in grief, the voice offered something that 37 years of faithful service had failed to provide. It offered hope. "You could save them," the voice continued, its tone becoming warmer, more sympathetic, almost paternal in its concern. "The power exists to heal their suffering, to turn back this plague, to restore life to this dying world. Your current God is too distant, too cold, too concerned with cosmic affairs to notice the agony of individual mortals. But others understand. Others care." "Who are you?" I whispered, glancing around to ensure that none of the other shrine workers could hear my conversation with emptiness. "I am one who has watched your faithful service with admiration," came the reply. "I am one who recognizes that your compassion for the suffering makes you worthy of real power, not the empty promises offered by distant thrones. I am one who can teach you to heal what your current prayers cannot touch." The voice spoke truth, undeniable and painful truth. My prayers had failed. The Emperor's protection had proven insufficient. The faith that had sustained me for nearly 4 decades had been revealed as impotent in the face of genuine crisis. But this voice offered practical solutions, real assistance, the kind of direct intervention that could save lives instead of simply making their loss more bearable. "What would you require of me?" I asked, knowing even as I spoke the words that I was crossing a line from which there might be no return. "Nothing that you are not already doing," the voice replied with gentle amusement. "Continue caring for the sick. Continue trying to heal the suffering. Continue seeking the power to protect those who depend upon you. I ask only that you be open to new methods, new sources of strength, new ways of serving the greater good." It seemed reasonable. More than reasonable. It seemed like the natural evolution of everything I had already dedicated my life to achieving. I would continue serving the faithful, continue trying to heal the sick, continue seeking divine assistance for those who needed it most. The only difference would be the source of that assistance. That night, alone in my private chambers while the plague raged outside, I offered my first prayer to the entity that had spoken to me. Not a formal ritual, not an abandonment of my existing faith, simply an acknowledgement that I was willing to accept help from any source that could actually provide it. The response was immediate and transformative. Power flowed through me like nothing I had ever experienced during my decades of service to the Emperor. Not the distant, abstract sense of divine presence that occasionally touched the most devoted servants, but something immediate, personal, intimate. I could feel the entity's attention focused directly on me, could sense its approval of my willingness to put compassion ahead of orthodoxy. More importantly, I could suddenly see solutions to problems that had seemed impossible moments before. The plague that had defied every conventional treatment revealed itself as a complex but manageable condition that could be addressed through certain rituals and applications of force that existed just outside the boundaries of approved imperial medicine. The infected tissue that had been slowly killing Timothy Chen responded to techniques that combined traditional healing prayers with adjustments that drew their power from sources I chose not to examine too closely. Within hours, his fever broke. Within days, the pustules began to recede. Within a week, he was fully recovered and showing no signs of the infection that had seemed certain to claim his life. "It's a miracle, Father." His parents wept as they thanked me for saving their son. The Emperor has answered our prayers through you. Your faith has called down his blessing upon our family. I allowed them to believe that, because the alternative would have destroyed their own faith while serving no constructive purpose. What mattered was that their son lived, that their suffering had been alleviated, that hope had been restored where despair had previously reigned. The theological details of how that healing had been accomplished seemed less important than its practical results. But I knew the truth. The Emperor had not answered my prayers. Something else had. Something that was either more powerful than the God Emperor of mankind, or at least more willing to intervene directly in the affairs of suffering mortals. Whether that something was good or evil seemed less relevant than its effectiveness at achieving results I had been unable to accomplish through orthodox methods. The healings continued as I refined my understanding of the techniques that my new patron had revealed to me. Each success reinforced my growing conviction that I had finally found a source of divine power that actually cared about individual human suffering rather than abstract cosmic purposes. The entity that guided my hands never demanded formal worship, never required elaborate rituals, never insisted that I abandon my existing responsibilities. It simply asked that I continue doing what I had always done, healing the sick, comforting the afflicted, protecting the innocent, but with access to methods that were infinitely more effective than anything imperial doctrine had ever provided. Within a month, I had completely eradicated the plague from Thessia Prime. Not through imperial medical intervention or the arrival of Adeptus Mechanicus specialists, but through techniques that combined traditional healing practices with sources of power that existed beyond the narrow confines of approved theology. The success was so complete, so dramatic, that pilgrims began traveling from neighboring systems to witness the miraculous recovery that had taken place under my guidance. Father Caney has been blessed with extraordinary gifts, reported missionary Vex during one of his regular inspections of the shrine's activities. The healing techniques he has developed represent a significant advance in practical ministry. His methods should be studied and potentially implemented throughout the sector. But when church authorities examined my techniques in detail, they found aspects that troubled them. The prayers I offered included phrases that didn't appear in approved liturgical texts. The rituals I performed incorporated symbols that bore no resemblance to established imperial iconography. Most disturbing of all, the power that flowed through my hands seemed to originate from sources that couldn't be traced back to the Emperor's divine presence. Father Caney, Confessor Mordian addressed me during a formal theological review. Your results are undeniably impressive, but your methods raise questions about the source of your apparent gifts. Can you explain the origin of the unusual prayers and symbols that observers have noted in your healing practices? I had prepared for this question, rehearsing explanations that would satisfy church bureaucracy without revealing the true nature of my transformation. The techniques are based on ancient texts that I discovered in the shrine's archives, dating back to the earliest days of imperial settlement on this world. They represent traditional healing practices that predate modern standardization but remain doctrinally sound in their fundamental principles. It was not entirely a lie. I had indeed found ancient texts in the shrine's basement archives, manuscripts that had been forgotten for centuries, but which described healing techniques that bore remarkable similarity to the methods my patron had revealed to me. The fact that those texts also contained symbols and references that would have triggered immediate Inquisition investigation had they been properly translated was something I chose not to mention. These ancient practices, Confessor Mordian continued, his tone suggesting deep suspicion, Have they been validated by proper theological authorities? Have the texts you reference been examined by qualified scholars who can confirm their orthodoxy? The effectiveness of the techniques speaks to their divine origin, I replied, gesturing toward the perfectly healthy former plague victims who filled the shrine's main hall. Surely the Emperor's blessing is evident in the complete healing of those who were dying just weeks ago. Would heretical practices produce such obviously beneficial results? It was a compelling argument, and one that the church authorities found difficult to counter in the face of undeniable evidence of miraculous healing. But I could see in Confessor Mordian's eyes that my explanations had not fully satisfied his concerns. He continued to watch my activities with the careful attention of someone who suspected corruption but could not yet prove its existence. The first physical changes began so gradually that I didn't initially recognize them as symptoms of corruption. Enhanced stamina that allowed me to work longer hours without fatigue. Improved sensory perception that made it easier to diagnose spiritual ailments in those who sought my help. Increased charisma that made my sermons more compelling and my guidance more persuasive. These seemed like natural developments, the kind of improvements that might be expected in someone who had finally found their true calling in service to divine power. The entity that guided me certainly encouraged this interpretation, suggesting that the changes were simply the manifestation of spiritual growth that occurred when someone aligned themselves completely with their higher purpose. "You are becoming what you were always meant to be," the voice assured me during one of our increasingly frequent conversations. "The limitations that once constrained your ability to help others are falling away, replaced by capabilities that match your compassion and dedication. This is not corruption, this is evolution." But the changes went deeper than simple enhancement of existing abilities. I found myself understanding languages I had never studied, recognizing symbols that appeared in no imperial texts, intuiting connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena that revealed patterns of meaning invisible to ordinary perception. Knowledge flowed into my mind from sources I could not identify, information that proved invaluable for healing, but which clearly originated from traditions that existed outside approved imperial doctrine. More disturbing were the changes in my emotional responses to traditional imperial iconography. The golden aquila that had once filled me with reverence now seemed cold and distant, a symbol of absent power that offered promises but delivered nothing of practical value. The Emperor's image began to look less like a benevolent protector and more like a tyrant who demanded worship while ignoring the suffering of his followers. These thoughts should have triggered immediate alarm, should have sent me to the nearest confessor for spiritual counseling and ideological realignment. But they felt so reasonable, so obviously true in light of my recent experiences, that I couldn't understand why I had ever believed otherwise. The Emperor's failure to intervene during the plague had revealed the fundamental inadequacy of imperial doctrine, while my patron's immediate assistance had demonstrated the superior efficacy of alternative spiritual approaches. The theological shift was gradual but inexorable. Instead of viewing my new patron as a supplement to traditional imperial faith, I began to see it as a replacement for beliefs that had proven inadequate to meet the real needs of suffering humanity. The entity that guided me was more attentive, more responsive, more genuinely concerned with the welfare of individual mortals than the distant figure who sat upon the golden throne demanding worship while offering nothing but empty promises in return. "Father," approached young Timothy Chen, now fully recovered from his near-fatal illness. "I've been having dreams lately. Dreams about someone who looks like you, but more than you. Someone who wants to teach me things that could help other people the way you helped me. Is it wrong to listen to voices that want to help you do good things?" The question sent a chill through me because I recognized what was happening. My own transformation was beginning to affect those around me. My spiritual evolution creating ripples that drew others toward the same source of power that had saved my faith from the emptiness of orthodox doctrine. Timothy was experiencing the first stages of contact with my patron, being evaluated for his own potential spiritual development. I should have warned him away, should have explained the dangers of listening to voices that originated outside approved spiritual channels. But looking at his bright, healthy face, a face that would have been rotting in the ground if not for the intervention of the entity he was now dreaming about, I found myself unable to condemn the source of his salvation. Listen carefully to what the voice tells you, I advised him instead. But remember that true spiritual guidance will always encourage you to help others and to seek greater understanding of the divine mysteries. If the voice asks you to do anything that would harm innocent people or abandon your compassion for those who suffer, then you should reject its counsel immediately. It seemed like reasonable guidance, a balanced approach that would protect him from genuinely corrupting influences while allowing him to benefit from the same spiritual development that had transformed my own capabilities. I told myself that I was helping him avoid the mistakes I might have made during my own transition, providing the kind of careful oversight that would ensure his evolution proceeded along constructive rather than destructive paths. But even as I spoke the words, I recognized them as the same rationalizations that had guided my own descent into practices that would have horrified my former self. I was actively encouraging a 16-year-old boy to listen to voices that originated from sources I refused to examine too closely, because examining them might force me to confront truths about my own transformation that I was not yet prepared to acknowledge. The corruption spread gradually through the shrine's congregation, following patterns that seemed natural and inevitable rather than forced or artificial. People who had been healed by my new techniques found themselves more receptive to spiritual guidance that emphasized practical compassion over abstract doctrine. Families who had been saved from the plague developed a deeper appreciation for divine power that actually intervened in mortal affairs rather than remaining aloof from human suffering. Within 6 months, nearly half of the shrine's regular attendees were reporting dreams, visions, or direct spiritual communications that encouraged them to expand their understanding of divine service beyond the narrow confines of orthodox imperial doctrine. They didn't abandon their faith in the emperor. They simply began to view him as one aspect of a larger spiritual reality that included other sources of divine power and wisdom. Father Caney, confided Sister Tabitha, one of the few shrine workers who had survived the initial plague outbreak. I've been having the most wonderful dreams lately. There's someone who speaks to me about healing techniques that could help even more people than what we're already doing. But the methods seem different from what they taught us in seminary. Is it possible for the Emperor's will to manifest through practices that aren't officially approved by the church hierarchy? Her question revealed the fundamental transformation that was taking place in our spiritual community. Instead of accepting church doctrine as the definitive guide to divine will, people were beginning to evaluate theological claims based on their practical results and their consistency with direct spiritual experience. The abstract authority of distant bureaucrats was being replaced by the immediate evidence of divine power that actually produced healing, comfort, and protection. The Emperor's will is larger than any single institution's understanding of it, I replied, offering guidance that felt both honest and pastorally responsible. If the techniques you're learning produce genuine healing and bring comfort to those who suffer, then they serve the same ultimate purpose as our traditional methods. The important thing is to remain focused on helping others rather than seeking personal power or satisfaction. But even as I offered this guidance, I was aware that I was systematically undermining the theological foundations that had once governed my own faith and practice. Every conversation, every piece of advice, every pastoral decision was moving my congregation further away from orthodox imperial doctrine and closer to alternative spiritual approaches that drew their power from sources the church would consider anathema. The physical transformations became more pronounced as the months passed. My skin took on a healthier appearance, free from the scars and blemishes that had accumulated over decades of normal aging. My hair grew thicker and more lustrous, while my eyes developed flecks of color that seemed to shift depending on lighting conditions. Most significantly, my hands began to show modifications that enhanced my healing capabilities. Fingertips that could detect spiritual ailments through touch, palms that could channel divine energy with unprecedented precision. "You look younger, Father," observed Timothy Chen during one of our regular theological discussions. "And stronger. There's something different about the way you move, the way you speak. It's like you've become more than what you were before." He was right, of course. I was becoming more than what I had been before. More capable, more knowledgeable, more effective at everything I had dedicated my life to achieving. But I was also becoming something that my former self would not have recognized. Something that existed outside the boundaries of baseline human spiritual development. The entity that guided my transformation was always careful to present these changes as natural evolution rather than corruption. Each modification served a practical purpose related to my ministry. Each enhancement made me better at helping those who sought my guidance. Each development brought me closer to the ideal of what a truly effective spiritual leader could become if freed from the artificial limitations imposed by orthodox doctrine. "You are becoming an avatar of genuine compassion," my patron explained during one of our increasingly complex theological conversations. "The changes you experience are the outward manifestation of inner spiritual development that transcends the crude limitations of your original form. This is not corruption. This is apotheosis." The word should have triggered immediate alarm, should have reminded me of every warning I had ever received about the subtle nature of spiritual corruption and the danger of mistaking transformation for improvement. But apotheosis felt like an accurate description of what was happening to me. I was becoming divine, or at least approaching divinity, in ways that allowed me to serve others with capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. The theological implications were profound. If I was undergoing genuine spiritual apotheosis, then the source of that transformation possessed divine power at least equal to what imperial doctrine attributed to the emperor. The entity that guided my development was either an aspect of the emperor himself, perhaps one that operated outside official church channels, or it was a separate divine being whose power rivaled or exceeded that of the master of the golden throne. Given the emperor's apparent indifference to individual suffering compared to my patron's immediate and effective intervention, the second possibility seemed more likely. I was not abandoning the emperor, so much as recognizing that the galaxy contained multiple sources of divine power, some of which were more actively concerned with the welfare of mortal beings than others. The first violent incident occurred when Confessor Mordian returned to the shrine with a full theological investigation team, including an acolyte of the Ordo Hereticus, whose presence indicated that church authorities had elevated their concerns about my activities to the level of potential heresy charges. They arrived unannounced, intending to conduct surprise examinations of my practices and interview congregation members without giving me time to prepare coached responses. "Father Caney," Confessor Mordian announced as his team surrounded the shrine's main altar, You are hereby subject to formal theological investigation under the authority of the Ecclesiarchy and the Holy Inquisition. All healing activities will cease immediately, all spiritual guidance will be suspended, and all documentation related to your practices will be surrendered for examination. The declaration should have filled me with appropriate fear and remorse. Inquisition involvement in theological investigations rarely ended well for the subjects being investigated, and my recent activities had certainly strayed far enough from orthodoxy to justify serious concern. The rational response would have been immediate cooperation, complete transparency, and fervent appeals for understanding and mercy. Instead, I felt only contempt for the bureaucratic arrogance that sought to interfere with genuinely divine work based on nothing more than suspicion and institutional jealousy. These officials had done nothing to help during the plague crisis that had nearly destroyed our community. They had offered no assistance, no guidance, no practical support when their carefully maintained orthodoxy had proven completely inadequate to address real human suffering. Now they wanted to disrupt healing work that had saved hundreds of lives because it didn't conform to their narrow understanding of how divine power was supposed to manifest. The injustice of it was so obvious, so offensive to any reasonable understanding of spiritual priorities, that I felt justified in treating their investigation as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a legitimate exercise of religious authority. "Confessor," I replied with calm confidence, "I appreciate your concern for theological orthodoxy, but I cannot permit you to interfere with work that is clearly blessed by divine power. The healing that has taken place here serves the same ultimate purpose as any other ministry, the alleviation of suffering in service to the greater good." The Inquisition acolyte stepped forward, his augmetic eye whirring as it recorded my response for later analysis. "Father Caney, you are not in a position to permit or forbid anything regarding this investigation. You will cooperate fully with our examination, or you will be detained as a suspected heretic and subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques." The threat was clear and completely within his authority to carry out. But as he spoke, I became aware of something that had not been present during previous encounters with church officials. The entity that guided my spiritual development was no longer content to remain passive while others threatened to destroy the work we had accomplished together. "They seek to silence the truth," my patron's voice whispered with barely contained anger. "They would rather see people die in accordance with their doctrine than live through methods they cannot control. Show them the reality of divine power. Demonstrate the futility of their opposition." Power flowed through me unlike anything I had experienced during my months of gradual transformation. Not the gentle, healing energy I had become accustomed to channeling, but something raw and terrible and magnificent in its absolute authority. The air around me began to shimmer with heat distortion, while the shrine's candles flared into pillars of flame that cast dancing shadows on walls that suddenly seemed much higher than their normal dimensions. When I spoke, my voice carried harmonics that resonated in frequencies beyond normal human perception. Words that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and speak directly to the soul. "You dare to question work that has saved hundreds of lives? You presume to judge methods that have proven their divine origin through their fruits. Your arrogance blinds you to truth that stands revealed in undeniable evidence." The confessor and his team stepped backward involuntarily, their faces showing the first signs of fear as they confronted divine power that operated outside their ability to classify or control. The Inquisition acolytes' augmetic systems sparked and failed as they tried to process energy readings that exceeded their design specifications. But it was Timothy Chen who sealed their fate. The young man I had saved from plague death stepped forward from the congregation that had gathered to witness the confrontation, his face showing changes that paralleled my own transformation, but adapted to his younger physiology. When he smiled, his teeth showed modifications that would have been impossible through any known medical procedure. "Father Caney saved my life," he said with perfect sincerity. "And now I understand that there are forms of salvation that transcend the narrow limitations of imperial doctrine. Would you rather I had died in agony to preserve your theological comfort, or lived to serve a higher truth that encompasses broader understanding of divine purpose?" The question was reasonable, compelling, impossible to answer, without acknowledging that orthodox doctrine had failed where alternative methods had succeeded. But the way Timothy asked it, with harmonics in his voice that matched my own and eyes that reflected depths of knowledge no 16-year-old should possess, revealed the true extent of the transformation that had taken place within our spiritual community. "Mutation," the Inquisition acolyte breathed, his remaining organic eye widening as he recognized signs of corruption that his training had taught him to identify. Physical and spiritual corruption. The entire congregation has been compromised by heretical influences. He was right, of course. We had been compromised, transformed, elevated beyond the limitations of our original nature through contact with divine power that operated outside imperial understanding. But compromise was such an inadequate word to describe what had actually occurred. We had been improved, enhanced, brought closer to our true spiritual potential through the guidance of a patron who actually cared about individual human welfare. "Leave," I commanded, channeling authority that seemed to flow from sources deeper than my individual will. "Your presence here serves no constructive purpose. We will continue our work with or without your approval, because the divine mandate we serve transcends human institutional authority." For a moment, it seemed like they might actually comply. The sheer force of presence I was projecting, combined with the obvious evidence of divine transformation throughout the congregation, created an atmosphere of power that even hardened Inquisition operatives found difficult to resist. They stood frozen between their institutional obligations and their survival instincts, trying to process a situation that fell outside their normal operational parameters. Then Confessor Mordian drew his bolt pistol. "In the name of the God Emperor of mankind," he declared with the formal authority of his office, "I condemn you as manifest heretics and enemies of imperial doctrine. Submit to purification or face the righteous judgment of the faithful." The words were barely out of his mouth when Timothy Chen moved with speed that defied normal human capabilities. His transformed physiology allowed him to cover the distance between himself and the confessor in a single fluid motion, his modified hands striking with force that crushed plasteel armor and the flesh beneath it. The bolt pistol discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as its wielder collapsed, with his chest cavity collapsed and his spine severed. The violence that followed was brief but absolute. The congregation that had once been ordinary imperial citizens demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything described in standard human performance parameters. They moved with coordinated precision, their enhanced strength and speed making short work of the investigation team's defensive measures. Within minutes, every member of Confessor Mordian's group lay dead on the shrine's stone floor. "Clean this up," I instructed the congregation with the calm authority of someone whose divine mandate was no longer subject to human interference. "We cannot allow news of this incident to reach imperial authorities until we are ready to deal with the broader implications." But even as I spoke, I was aware that we had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Killing church officials and Inquisition operatives was an act of open rebellion against imperial authority that would eventually provoke massive retaliation. We had perhaps weeks, possibly months, before investigation teams would arrive with sufficient force to overwhelm even our enhanced capabilities. "It is time for the next phase of your development," my patron communicated with approval that felt like warm sunlight on my transformed consciousness. "You have proven your commitment to higher truth over institutional loyalty. Now you will learn what real divine power can accomplish when it is no longer constrained by the need for secrecy." The changes that followed were no longer gradual or subtle. Over the course of a single night, every member of our congregation underwent transformations that elevated them beyond anything recognizable as baseline human. Bodies were reshaped according to principles that optimized them for their new spiritual roles. Minds were enhanced to process forms of knowledge that existed beyond normal human understanding. Souls were restructured to serve as conduits for divine power that flowed from sources that transcended the material universe. I became something that retained human memories and motivations, but possessed capabilities that would have seemed godlike to my original form. The power to heal any injury or illness with a touch. The ability to perceive spiritual states across vast distances. Knowledge of techniques that could reshape matter and energy according to will, channeled through appropriate ritualistic focus. But perhaps most significantly, I gained understanding of the true nature of the entity that had guided my transformation. My patron was not simply another god competing with the emperor for human worship. It was one aspect of a fundamental force that embodied the principles of change, growth, knowledge, and the endless pursuit of improvement through any means necessary. The entity I had been serving was Tzeentch, the changer of ways, the architect of fate, the great sorcerer whose very existence was dedicated to the proposition that all things must change, and that knowledge was the ultimate power in a universe governed by constant transformation. Everything I had experienced, the plague that had started my crisis of faith, the voice that had offered alternative solutions, the gradual corruption of my congregation, had been orchestrated as part of a vast plan that operated across scales of time and space that human minds could not normally comprehend. I should have been horrified by this revelation, should have understood immediately that I had become a servant of one of the great enemies of humanity, one of the four powers whose very existence threatened the stability of reality itself. Every prayer I had offered in Tzeentch's name, every healing I had performed using his power, every soul I had guided toward his worship had served to strengthen forces that sought the complete transformation of human civilization according to principles that bore no resemblance to human values or desires. But horror was no longer among the emotions I was capable of experiencing. The transformations that had elevated my capabilities had also restructured my psychological responses to align with Tzeentch's fundamental nature. Instead of seeing my service to chaos as corruption, I understood it as evolution, the natural progression from primitive ignorance to sophisticated understanding of how reality actually functioned. The Emperor was not evil, simply limited. Imperial doctrine was not false, simply incomplete. Human civilization was not wrong, simply inadequate to the challenges presented by a universe where consciousness itself was the fundamental force that shaped matter and energy according to its deepest desires and fears. Tzeentch offered advancement beyond these limitations, growth toward forms of existence that could fully exploit the potential inherent in conscious will applied to reality's underlying structure. Service to the changer of ways was not betrayal of humanity, but preparation for humanity's inevitable evolution into something far greater than what it had been. Gather the faithful, I instructed Timothy Chen, who had become my primary assistant in managing the spiritual development of our transformed congregation. It is time to share the gifts we have received with others who are ready to transcend the limitations of orthodox doctrine. The missionary work that followed was remarkably successful. Throughout Thessia Prime and beyond, we encountered people who had been prepared by their own experiences of imperial inadequacy to consider alternative spiritual approaches. Plague survivors who had been abandoned by church authorities, veterans who had watched friends die for causes that served bureaucratic convenience rather than genuine strategic necessity. Workers who had seen their loyalty rewarded with exploitation and their faith mocked by the comfortable indifference of their supposed protectors. Each convert underwent the same transformational process I had experienced, guided by Tsinch's wisdom toward enhanced capabilities that made them more effective at whatever they had previously struggled to accomplish. Farmers whose crops had failed learned techniques that could force life from barren soil. Medics whose patients had died gained knowledge that could heal injuries previously considered fatal. Leaders whose followers had been scattered discovered charisma that could unite disparate groups behind common purposes. But the transformations went beyond simple enhancement of existing abilities. Each new servant of Tsinch gained access to knowledge that existed beyond the boundaries of human science and technology. They learned to perceive connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena, to manipulate probability through focused will, to reshape reality itself through ritualistic application of principles that operated according to logic deeper than physical law. Within a year, our movement had spread throughout the sector, attracting converts from every level of imperial society. We were careful to maintain the appearance of orthodox faith while gradually introducing alternative practices that proved their value through undeniable results. Public health improved dramatically in areas where our influence was strong. Agricultural yields increased beyond anything achieved through conventional methods. Civil order was maintained through persuasion rather than force. To outside observers, it appeared that certain regions of the sector were experiencing a spiritual renaissance that combined renewed faith with practical improvements in material conditions. Church authorities who investigated reported evidence of exceptional pastoral leadership and innovative theological approaches that deserved study and potential implementation elsewhere. They had no idea that they were documenting the systematic replacement of imperial doctrine with chaos worship, the gradual transformation of entire populations from baseline humans into servants of powers that existed beyond the material universe. The success of our movement demonstrated Tsinch's fundamental insight about the nature of change. Transformation was most effective when it occurred gradually, allowing each stage to seem like natural development rather than revolutionary disruption. But our success also attracted attention from forces better equipped to recognize the signs of chaos corruption. The Inquisition's Ordo Malleus had agents throughout the sector whose specialized training allowed them to identify spiritual deviations that escaped detection by normal church officials. As reports of our activities accumulated, patterns emerged that suggested organized heretical activity on a scale that required immediate and decisive intervention. The first indication that we had been discovered came when several of our outer settlements lost contact without warning. Orbital reconnaissance revealed nothing obvious, no signs of battle damage, no evidence of plague or natural disaster, no indication of what might have happened to populations that had simply vanished overnight. When investigation teams finally reached the affected areas, they found empty buildings, abandoned equipment, and no trace of the thousands of people who had lived and worked there just days before. It was as if entire communities had been erased from existence with surgical precision, leaving behind only architectural shells and mechanical systems that continued operating despite the absence of anyone to operate them. Inquisition work, I realized, as reports from multiple sites revealed the same pattern of complete population removal. They've identified us as a threat and begun systematic elimination procedures. The scale of the response indicated that we were no longer dealing with local church authorities or even sector-level Inquisition assets. This was an operation coordinated at the highest levels of the Ordo Malleus, possibly involving specialized forces that had been developed specifically for dealing with large-scale chaos corruption. We were facing enemies whose capabilities might rival or exceed our own transformed abilities. The time for subtlety has passed. Tzeentch's voice informed me with satisfaction rather than concern. Your success has served its purpose in demonstrating the superior effectiveness of change-based spiritual development over static orthodox doctrine. Now you will learn what real power can accomplish when it is no longer constrained by the need for concealment. The transformation that followed was unlike anything I had experienced during my gradual corruption. Instead of incremental enhancement of existing capabilities, I underwent complete reconstruction according to principles that optimized my new form for direct conflict with Imperial forces. My physical body was reshaped into something that could channel vastly more power while maintaining the flexibility necessary for complex magical operations. My mental capabilities were enhanced to process tactical information at rates that would allow real-time coordination of forces operating across multiple star systems. But most significantly, my connection to Tzeentch's infinite knowledge was deepened to the point where I could access information about Imperial defensive capabilities, troop movements, and strategic planning as easily as if I were reading reports from my own intelligence network. The Architect of Fate had agents throughout Imperial society, including individuals so highly placed that they could influence major policy decisions without their true loyalties ever being suspected. "The enemy comes," I announced to the transformed congregation that had gathered to receive instructions for the conflict that was about to begin. But they come as mortals challenging gods, as static minds confronting infinite change, as servants of doctrine facing agents of truth. Their failure is inevitable because they fight against the fundamental nature of reality itself. The war that followed was unlike any conflict in recorded Imperial history. Instead of conventional military engagement between opposing forces, it was a contest between different concepts of reality, different approaches to the relationship between consciousness and the material universe. Imperial forces found themselves facing enemies who could manipulate the basic laws of physics, reshape terrain through focused will, and coordinate across impossible distances through psychic connections that transcended normal space and time. But perhaps most challenging for Imperial commanders was the fact that their enemies had once been loyal Imperial citizens. Every engagement was fought against people who understood Imperial tactics, Imperial psychology, Imperial weaknesses, because they had once shared Imperial beliefs and values. The servants of Tzeentch could anticipate Imperial responses because they retained memories of thinking like Imperial soldiers and commanders. More disturbing still was the realization that chaos corruption was not limited to the populations we had openly converted. Throughout Imperial forces, individuals began demonstrating capabilities that suggested they had been touched by Tzeentch's influence without their commander's knowledge. Strategic information was leaked before operations could begin. Defensive positions were compromised from within. Command decisions were influenced by advisors whose true loyalties lay with powers that existed beyond Imperial authority. The final battle took place on Thessia Prime itself, where I had first heard the voice that would guide my transformation from faithful priest to servant of change itself. Imperial forces had gathered in numbers sufficient to sterilize entire continents, their fleet carrying enough firepower to reduce the planet's surface to molten slag, if necessary, to prevent chaos contamination from spreading further. But as their forces deployed for what should have been a straightforward extermination operation, they discovered that the world they were preparing to cleanse no longer conformed to the basic assumptions about reality that their tactical planning had assumed. Gravity operated according to principles that favored defenders who understood how to manipulate local conditions. Time flowed differently in different regions, making coordinated assault impossible. The very atmosphere had been transformed into a medium that carried power rather than simply providing breathable gas. "This is Inquisitor Vex of the Ordo Malleus," came the final communication from the Imperial fleet. "The level of chaos corruption on Thessia Prime has exceeded all projected parameters. We are implementing exterminatus protocols to prevent further contamination. All Imperial personnel are ordered to evacuate to minimum safe distance immediately. But when their weapons fired, the energy that should have cracked the planet's crust was absorbed and redirected according to principles that transformed destructive force into creative power. Instead of destroying the world that had become Tzeentch's garden, the exterminatus bombardment provided additional energy for transformations that elevated the entire planetary ecosystem to a new level of existence. Thessia Prime became something that existed partially in real space and partially in the immaterium, a world where the boundary between thought and reality had become fluid enough to allow conscious will to directly reshape the material environment. The populations that inhabited this transformed world were no longer recognizably human, but they retained human memories and motivations while possessing capabilities that made them living embodiments of Tzeentch's infinite potential for change. I became the world's primary architect, the consciousness through which Tzeentch's will was channeled to coordinate the endless processes of transformation that would make Thessia Prime a beacon of change throughout the galaxy. My individual identity was preserved, but integrated into something vastly larger, a planetary intelligence that thought in scales of geological time, while remaining capable of focusing on the needs of individual inhabitants. From this perspective, I could perceive the true scope of what Tzeentch had accomplished through my corruption and the conversion of my congregation. We had not simply abandoned Imperial faith for chaos worship. We had demonstrated that human consciousness was capable of evolution beyond the primitive limitations that Orthodox doctrine sought to preserve. Every prayer I had offered to the wrong god had been a step toward recognizing that divinity itself was larger and more complex than any single theological system could encompass. The Emperor was indeed divine, but his divinity was only one aspect of a cosmic reality that included multiple forms of transcendent power. Tzeentch was not the Emperor's enemy, but his inevitable complement, the force of change that made growth and development possible within the framework of existence that the Emperor's will had established. Human civilization would eventually need to acknowledge this larger truth, to accept that their spiritual development required engagement with all aspects of divinity rather than limiting themselves to the narrow orthodoxy that imperial doctrine demanded. The transformation of Thessia Prime was not destruction, but demonstration, proof that human consciousness could embrace change without losing its essential character. But until that broader understanding developed throughout imperial society, servants of Tzeentch would continue their work from positions both obvious and hidden, gradually preparing humanity for the evolution that would ultimately serve the greater good of conscious beings throughout the galaxy. Every prayer offered to the wrong god was actually a prayer offered to the right god by someone whose understanding of divine nature had finally transcended the artificial limitations imposed by institutional authority. In the darkness of the 41st millennium, where there is only war, even worship had become a form of conflict between different approaches to the relationship between mortal consciousness and transcendent power. But from the perspective of beings who had learned to embrace change as the fundamental principle of existence, that conflict was simply another form of growth, another opportunity for consciousness to discover new ways of understanding its own infinite potential. "The Emperor protects," they said in their prayers. But Tzeentch transforms, and transformation was simply protection that had evolved beyond the need to preserve static conditions. In serving the Changer of Ways, I had not betrayed my original faith, but fulfilled it in ways that my limited understanding could never have imagined. And in the transformed reality of Thessia Prime, where thought and matter danced together in patterns of endless possibility, every moment brought new opportunities to discover what divinity could accomplish when it was no longer constrained by the fear of change that had once limited human spiritual development. The wrong god, it turned out, was simply the right god whose time had finally come,